part 2 of an interview with Andy Nowicki, Dresden and Total War.
Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. My guest this evening is Andy Nowicki. Andy, how you doing?
Very good, Tim. Good to be back with you again.
Well, thanks for coming back. I wanted to talk to you tonight about an article that you penned. Well, I think you actually wrote it a couple of years ago, but you reposted it on the anniversary of the Dresden firebombing. And
yes.
In that article, you touch on not just the bombing, but also a lot of the controversy regarding the war and revisionism and the sides people take and the justifications they make for their respective sides and waging total war and terror bombing and mass civilian deaths. So when you wrote this, obviously you were writing this on the anniversary of the bombing itself, so that obviously that was that's why you wrote it, when you wrote it. Mm-hmm. But why did you decide to write it?
Well, I initially wrote the article, which is entitled "Dresden Was Not Da Bomb," somewhat of a cheeky title for a very serious and tragic subject matter. Mm-hmm. But that's sort of the way I approach things sometimes. And I actually wrote the article initially 2 years ago, when it was the 70th anniversary of the bombing of Dresden. And I guess I'm just for a while I've been aware of the double standards that obtain these days, where certain atrocities are recognized as atrocities and maybe even exaggerated to some degree, or they're encouraged. It's encouraged in our minds to think of them as mega atrocities, as more atrocious than they can possibly than we can possibly imagine them being, as if the initial atrocity isn't bad enough, such as what happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany, which of course was a terrible thing. But other things, other bad behavior, bad evil events, things that were done, that are clearly against the moral law, especially in wartime. The notion that you don't do evil so that good may result, which was clearly not the case in World War II. It was not, as they say, a Manichaean war between good and evil. There were a lot of complications. There was, dare I say, good and evil on both sides, on all sides. And unfortunately, what both sides did were, they both engaged in numerous atrocities.
Because they had already, France and Britain had declared war on Germany. Even Germany's assault on Norway, which they merely beat Great Britain to the punch. Britain was trying to invade first. So they're all doing that. That's what happens, and that's it's nothing really new, nothing unique. You can criticize, but it certainly doesn't distinguish Germany from other countries, other great powers, all of which had huge empires engaged in some form of aggression or another to acquire their empires. Britain didn't acquire its global empire by consent, and
right.
We hear about obviously the horrible death toll in the labor camps, and of course there's a lot of dispute about what was really going on there, because there's a lot of post-war propaganda for post-war reasons. But we hear very little about things like the Bengal famine in India that the British created by exporting all the food. And this was a forced famine that killed, over 2 million people. And that's as brutal as anything Stalin did in the Ukraine.
Right. That's what it makes me think of the Ukraine.
Yeah. So, but we don't hear about that, nor are there movies, nor are there monuments made about it.
No.
Aren't there many monuments? Isn't much recognition given to the Ukraine? And you ask yourselves, why were people in the Ukraine incentivized to sign up with the Ukrainian SS battalions? Because they were fighting the Russians, and there were many of the executioners in Ukraine were Jewish, Kaganovich, and these people. Same thing in the Baltic states. So there was a lot of payback going on here. That Americans, we have a very triumphal view of the war, and we don't care about the complexities that was going on there. But a lot of people, a lot of Russians decided to sign up with the Germans to fight Stalin. A lot of Ukrainians did. A lot of Lithuanians did. And they weren't Nazis. They were just caught in a vice grip, and they were making the best of a very bad situation. So And it isn't to say that, and particularly the war in the East, when you had these, the Einsatz group and these police battalions going on, carrying out this anti-Kamazar order. What happens? This was very much like what's going on in Vietnam with the Phoenix program. Mm-hmm. And so before you condemn Germany and it's as being uniquely evil, this happens in every war. And it's horrible. It's a reason not to go to war, because these things always happen when you send young men into a foreign land armed, and this is going to happen. And because what happened even in Russia, what happened? Stalin would dress people up as German soldiers and commit atrocities. You can see that happening. And there was a case in the Donbass region. This was in the summer of '42. The Germans were driving south, I think, towards the Black Sea of Stalingrad, and they intercepted a train that was this was forced. These were people being removed, ethnic Germans, and I think they were Georgians and Georgians. I think Georgians. They were being removed by Stalin to send to the Gulag or labor camps.
His own countrymen.
Yeah, and the Germans liberated the train.
Because he was Georgian.
The German soldiers liberated the train, and many people survived the war because of the Germans. So from their standpoint, the war is very different than maybe a Jew might remember the war, who was put into a labor camp. This is how complicated it is.
Yes, sure. Now, this is kind of tangentially related to what you're talking about, but something I've wondered about lately is, it seems like if we're talking about propaganda or the arts, and sometimes the line is blurred between those two. It seems like in the last few years there has been a rash of movies that have been very, and this is culminated in the new Mel Gibson movie. The name of it escapes me right now. The one that was. I think it got some Academy Award nominations.
About the medic?
Yes, about the pacifist.
Yeah,
the medic.
Conscientious objector, pacifist.
Yes, exactly.
Ridge or Hill?
Yes, that's right.
Something Ridge, right?
Right. Like this movie, and there was another one a couple of years ago that directed by Angelina Jolie, Unbroken.
Yes.
And there was this new Scorsese movie. This wasn't set during the war, but Scorsese's my favorite director, and he directed this movie called Silence, which was based on an account of Jesuit the great the time in I guess it was the 17th century when the Japanese powers were persecuting Christians, just this intense and
that's right.
very very cruel, to a great extent. Not that persecution is ever nice, but they really had some inventive ways of just tormenting and torturing people. This movie called Silence. And it seems like there's been a couple of others where the Japanese just don't come across all that well. And it's interesting to me in our age of political correctness. Maybe we're starting to come out of political correctness now. I don't know, a little bit, but it seems like it's now accepted to have movies which present the Japanese in an extremely negative light, where it's like yellow man bad, white man good. You wouldn't think that would fly in our day of political correctness, but
it's like the movies in the '90s with the Arabs. Remember that?
Yeah, and it's like the exception is made when it's the Japanese, and I've been wondering about that. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, the Fu Manchu thing, the early 20th century, the Orient, the idea of the barbaric East and all that, Orient and all that.
Right.
So that goes way back in American culture.
Sure.
I think it was Harry Truman was reading
the inscrutable. They used to call them.
Yeah, but he used to write in McCall's magazine like these serial stories about evil Chinese and Asiatics coming in and taking over the West, and this would form his, obviously this reform or somehow have some impact on the decisions he would take years later when he was president, right? I mean, there's a reason, you could, firebomb and kill as many Asians, and this coincides with America's expansion into Asia.
Sure.
And in order to justify that empire, because it was very brutal. People don't know about how the Philippines were subdued. Hundreds of thousands of Filipinos perished in that war. It was very brutal. And a lot of those practices were applied home, and a lot of the soldiers came back and became police officers and used those tactics on minorities here in the United States. So, the empire has come home, right? I mean, that's
right.
And I think it was Alfred McCoy wrote a book about that. It's called Policing America's Empire. It's about the occupation of the Philippines and its impact. The same way the Phoenix program, the Vietnam War, now is the template for Department of Homeland Security.
And I know George Webb has been talking a little bit about that.
And also Douglas Valentine's book about the Phoenix program. He made that point back in the 90s. This is back in the 90s in his book on the Phoenix program, that this was being applied domestically. I mean, Marcus Wolf, this Stasi guy, was the consultant for how the DHS was going to be set up. These.
Oh, really?
The lives of others, those people.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So this is this same way in World War II when they brought over Gehlen and the Nazis to form the Soviet desk and because that's how you have the Cold War. You want them because they're the ones who knew how to fight the Ruskies because they've been fighting for 4 years on the Eastern Front. So you got to incorporate them, and then they're kind of an effect, and all the
Operation Paperclip, and
all that stuff. Right? So, and the reason for Operation Paperclip is multifaceted. It wasn't just that. So,
sure. Well, my thesis for why it's now okay. I mean, I think with all of what you're saying is true, and it probably has existed in a low level kind of way, and hasn't been discouraged, or a high level kind of way. Even if it's even if we're living in a time where racism is considered the sin against the Holy Ghost.
Yeah.
If you're white, to be racist against others. But I think that now my thesis, my idea, and it's just sort of it's not really a hypothesis. It's not really.
No, I think you're onto
thesis.
Something.
I'm wondering if it has to do with the opening up of China. If China's a bigger market now, and they make movies. And geared towards the China market.
Oh, that's Hollywood being taken. They're buying into Hollywood pictures, and they're
and the Chinese hate the Japanese.
Yeah, and they have all those dollars to spend that they've accumulated, and now they're.
And so maybe making these movies with an anti-Japanese kind of aesthetic.
Obviously the Jewish domination from Hollywood affected how things are portrayed. It's affected the Hollywood product, whether it's the movies, with the smut and the sex, and also with the World War II interpretation. And as the Jewish influence became more prominent after the 60s, you notice that the Holocaust itself came to define the Second World War. If you watch movies made about the Second World War in the late 40s, 50s, and mid-60s, the Holocaust plays a very little role in it. It's like it's hardly even. You don't see it in The Great Escape. You just know the Germans are bad. You don't see it in Orion Express and these things. But it's in the 70s and the rise of the neoconservatives and the I guess you could say the decline of the WASP elite and the ascendancy of Jewish power in America. Overt, I think. It was always very significant. Affecting media, music, entertainment, and these things. There's an ethnic component to this, and it's certain geopolitical interest, whether it's Zionist interest or Chinese interest. Yeah, you're onto something.
What I'm talking about might be more of a commercial endeavor that that it's it appeals to the Chinese to show the Japanese in a bad light,
and so, it's a huge market over there. What you're saying,
that's opening up more and more. I don't know. It's just an idea, just a thesis or a hypothesis, really, but.
Well, you heard about what happened with the remake of Red Dawn, right?
Yes, I'd forgotten about that.
So that's
they were going. It was how it turned out. They were going to make it. Were they originally? It was going to be a Chinese invasion,
which is ridiculous, but it's somewhat more. Just looking at
the
size
at least
of China
has a more significant.
They got enough people to send over. They could get them over here, but North Korea and the United States. That's more like the mouse that roared, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I'd forgotten about the Red Dawn remake. I actually saw it, and it really tickled me, that the whole North Korea invasion of America. That's pretty wild.
That it's that is funny. Yeah, that's a good point though. You're right about how they flex their muscle.
Yeah,
financially, whether it's some sort of geopolitical or cultural agenda, or just simply to cater to the burgeoning market over there for movies.
Yeah, that's just my thought on the whole thing, because it is striking when you watch Heartbreak Ridge. I think that's what it's called, or Unbroken. You really have this aesthetic that might seem quote unquote racist to many people, because you've got these strong, hardy white guys doing their duty in hellish conditions, being menaced and sadistically treated by these filthy infernal Japs. I mean,
yeah. Well, to this day,
they don't make it as it's not as open or upfront, but aesthetically speaking, it's all there and it's in your face, and they don't skimp on the atrocities,
No.
and it is almost Manichaean, white is good, yellow bad, and it's really quite extraordinary to see this bumper crop of movies. I guess Silence is a little bit different because it's set in the past, and I think it has more artistic integrity in a way, but it's of a piece with some of these other bigger budget, more significant movies that these World War II movies set in the East, and so it's just striking. It's one of those things I've noticed.
That's the impression people get of that war, because the war in the Pacific was much more of a racial war than it was in the European theater, for obvious reasons, because you had Italian Americans, German Americans, French Americans, and from all accounts, the Germans, if you look at the conditions of the German prison camps, they did the best. The prisoners were treated rather well in relative terms. Mm-hmm. The survival rate was over 90%.
Yeah, sure.
And so in
they
fact,
abided by the rules of war. What are they called?
The Geneva Convention.
Geneva Convention rules.
The Red Cross did it, and also the prison camps were run by the Luftwaffe. Which really wasn't controlled by the Nazis, and that's we see that actually if you watch Hogan's Heroes, that's actually you see that element to it portrayed in there. Also, in The Great Escape, where you have the Luftwaffe is an old gentleman soldier running it, and he doesn't like dealing with the Gestapo. In the East, I mean in Asia, in the Pacific theater, Americans quickly gained the reputation for not taking prisoners. And a lot of that was because of the reports of the Bataan Death March and the fact that they hated Japs. There's a racial thing. Of course, here in the United States, Japanese in the West on the West Coast were forced to sell their property and live in concentration camps. In fact, a funny story is part of the Hyatt Hotel empire is based on property that was stolen by the Hyatt family through some of their friends in the federal government, stolen hotels and properties and all that. I read about that in Gus Russo's book Super Mob, about the Jewish mafia. But one of the reasons why Japanese were so ferocious, we think it's because of the Bushido warrior ethos they had. Well, one of the things is that the Americans didn't take prisoners. And there's a picture. How brutal this was is how there's a picture in Life magazine of a pretty girl writing a letter to her loved one overseas, and she's staring at the Japanese skull.
I remember. I came across that. That is pretty striking. That would be an interesting thing to link to. Mm-hmm. If you can find it.
Yeah, what's that? Yeah, I see. Go on. Just put Japanese skull. So this was the hatred that Americans call Germans krauts, but listen, they really disliked the Japanese, and it was a racial thing, and that's one of the primary reasons the Japanese were so ferocious and didn't surrender, because they were often get machine gunned, and it's wartime, and it's their and if
it's their home too. That's another thing.
Yeah,
another
Okinawa. Yeah, and it's much easier if the person you're killing looks different than you. And Germans and Italians, they don't look very much different than us, and that's a racial element to it, though. And that's also in when the Russians advanced into Germany and they raped so many German women. But a lot of that weren't the first line soldiers. It was the Mongol soldiers that came in, and of course they were encouraged by Ilya Ehrenberg, the Soviet propagandist, Commissar, who encouraged them to rape, take their women, rape them, kill their children. Germans are fascists. They must all be killed. The entire race must be wiped out. And he has a memorial in Israel today, at the Yvad, at the museum there.
Wow.
And and so I mean, like you said, there's a lot of blood on everyone's hands.
Yeah.
And there was a racial thing. It was a racial thing to go in, and that's an old war thing. When you go in, you conquer land. What do? You take the women, and you taint the bloodline. That's an old.
It's old as time.
Yeah.
It's in the Bible too.
Yeah. So, and another thing the problem when people talk about Allied war crimes, people think you're excusing Germany's war crimes, and often what it is, you're just engaging in historical correction or rebalancing, so their peers, everyone knows about the German war crimes. And of course, I think there's more controversy in some of the the degree of it and the reason for it. I think there's reasons for debate there that shouldn't be illegal, nor should you go into prison for it. But you've heard about Eisenhower's death camps.
Yeah, I have. Yes.
Yeah, 2 million soldiers just put out in the open and left to die. We weren't allowed to. They were denied Red Cross packages, and so then the German citizens themselves weren't allowed to bring food and water and clothing to them, and they just left to die. And Eisenhower made this decision. And
we think of Eisenhower as such a great guy, and he was the one who targeted the military-industrial complex, even.
Yeah, but the thing about that is what I'm thinking is that it appeared to be a partial implementation of the Morgenthau Plan. And that called for the destruction of, the deindustrialization, depopulation of Germany.
Just the deindustrialization, making them into a pastoral place, just wiping out all vestiges of modern civilization.
And you have Kaufman's book, Germany Must Be Destroyed, written in 1940, American. And so they're calling for the destruction of Germany. And so Germany, when the Morgenthau Plan was released, obviously the Germans realized that obviously we can't surrender to these people. Yeah,
that doesn't help matters, does it? Yeah.
But it would appear the objective was to drag it out as long as possible, do as much destruction as possible. Because part of the psychological warfare, cutting off, decapitating the German people morally and intellectually, would be destroying Dresden, destroying these historical German cities so they can put up modern cities, and they're cut off from their past. And I think the two topless women you refer to are a product of that process, because these old German cities have been around for millennia, and that's culture. That's something to be proud of. You destroy it, no longer there, and it's easy to undermine the native culture, which is what imperialism is mostly about, right? That's the psychological conquest of the natives.
And maybe just to bring this full circle, you talked about how there wasn't really much of a discussion of Holocaust-related stuff before the mid-'60s or thereabouts. It also in an interesting way, there's an interesting sort of mirroring there with Dresden and other Allied war crimes, but it's particularly Dresden, because it wasn't until, I guess, the mid to late 60s it was really David Irving who first shone the light on what happened in Dresden, and he published his book. What was it, 66, 67?
Yeah,
sometime around there.
And he was in his 20s.
Yeah, and it was, of course, he's a very controversial figure today, and he's gone a lot farther in the other direction, but I mean, and somewhat of a notorious character. But really that he deserves a lot of credit for bringing attention to what really took place there. And also, we should acknowledge Kurt Vonnegut.
Oh yes, Slaughterhouse-Five, yeah.
His novel Slaughterhouse-Five, which also that was sort of the centerpiece. I mean, it's this kind of weird postmodern book with this narrative where the guy travels time trips and goes from the past to the present to the future and all this stuff, and it's really weird and surreal. But a big chunk of the book, and again, in some ways, the moral center of the book is the Allied attack on Dresden and what resulted and the effect that it had on the main character of the book. And I think that was the first maybe major fiction work that drew attention to Dresden, and that was also maybe around the same time, maybe a little later than Irving's book.
Well, the book, yeah, the movie came out I think early 70s. And that's why I first got when I was watching, like, you know, I remember the old days when you got network television, you had the late movie on Friday or Saturday night. Like 2 a.m, you just stay up late and watch these weird movies that you can never catch. And that's why I first started Dr. Strangelove. It was like 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning. What is this? You know, not knowing what to make of it because I'm only 13 years old. You know, and of course I'm 50 now and I still don't know what to make of it. But that's the whole point. That's Kubrick's genius, I guess. But Slaughterhouse, I saw Slaughterhouse-Five. I think I was like 13 or 14. It's the weirdest movie ever. You know, it's one that just draws you in. And I saw the movie, you know, before I ever heard of the book. Yeah, what is this, Dresden? And yeah, you did got your. But one of this thing is that people will, I guess, justify it because they think, well, you know, it was war. We needed to do this. Obviously, when you're bombing the German cities, the Germans have to devote planes to defend the cities. It takes them away from the front, particularly the Eastern Front. That was one of the reasons why the Germans lost the air superiority in the Eastern Front, was the requirement to try to defend the cities from bombing. So you could make a military argument, although that is still utilitarian. It's not morally justifiable because in the old days you don't target civilians. That was the idea. You don't.
There's a code of honor.
There's a code of honor. You don't say, well, less soldiers should die, so in order to prevent soldiers dying, we need to target civilians. The idea is soldiers were legitimate targets, civilians weren't. But this,
when you say the old days, of course, you mean a certain period of time in the Western world between like the late 17th century and maybe the mid 19th century.
Yeah, probably as late as 1870s, probably. Yeah. But I think it has to do a lot. Again, I said earlier, it has something to do with the democratic age and the People's War. Everyone's now engaged. Economically, it's total war. Everything's a target now. Factories, you know, this mechanization of warfare. So you have to bomb the factories. People live near the factories. So, but that isn't the case because first of all, the bombing, the airplanes, the resources that the air war took, were huge, and it took away from like maybe campaigns in the Battle of the Atlantic, and also, I think it was the average loss for every sortie was 10%. So if you're flying 10 missions, you have a good chance of getting blown out of the sky.
Oh, and they were definitely taking a lot of hits there.
But even according to the War Department's strategic bombing survey in 1946, said the air war itself actually inhibited the war because it stiffened Germany's back. It actually increased morale. It didn't demoralize the public. It actually people became like anything. You're going to support your government when they're.
It had the opposite effect of what
had the opposite effect. Another thing is they underestimated Germany's ability to adapt. I think German war production peaked as late as the fall of 1944, then plummeted. But if they had just targeted the oil fields and the rail yards and the bridges and refinery centers, Germany would have not had any fuel and would have been able to wage war as long as she had without the fuel. I think by May 1945, Germany they didn't have enough gasoline for Hitler's Mercedes. But if they had done this earlier in the war, in fact, they even say if the British, instead of bombing Berlin in 1940, had targeted key bridges and transport areas, it would have severely limited Germany's ability to wage offensive war in the early part of the war. So it really was a misdirection, but it leads me to believe that maybe something else was was the objective.
So you think that maybe it was the leaders of these the Allied leaders were so
the high cabal, as Churchill referred to. I think you have our titular leaders, or the leaders that are retailed to us, the Roosevelts, the Churchills.
Yeah.
But they all talk about a high cabal, and even Roosevelt talked about that, and that we're really ruled by personages we never see. And I think if you look at the long stretch of what the war represented, and you take into Anglo-American, particularly Anglo, but it became Anglo-American strategy, was this Mackinder doctrine. And the idea was Britain always sought to destabilize and weaken the continent, and it always played powers off against each other on the continent, whether it's France, Germany, or Russia. And of course, the big thing in World War I was this cordial entente cordiale, reggie, when England decided to align itself with France against Germany, and then divide Germany from Russia, and the thinking that England didn't have the capacity to really go after Germany directly or Russia directly, but if she could get Germany to fight Russia, then weaken both, and that would weaken the continent, Germany, and it would prevent the Eurasian landmass from unifying and developing, and that certainly helps England maintain her global dominance as a seafaring nation, as a naval power. And we see that why that analysis is important is because we see it being played out today with the Russians, and trying to play the Russians against the Chinese, and trying to divide Russia from Europe, and these things, and fearing Putin's Russia, and so
right. So then I guess that raises the question: was are all these new developments going contra, like the election of Trump and the passing of Brexit and the rise of nationalism in the West?
I believe it's some kickback. I think it's some resistance to it, and
so it's not part of the plan. You're saying you don't think that it's like
no. I think maybe this is the optimist speaking, because I could just say that everything's controlled and there's no point to it all. But things are more complex than that. I do think things are largely orchestrated and managed, but within that management, there's developments that they don't plan for, and they have to improvise. And I don't think the ruling, the anointed ruling elite are monolithic in these things. And I've talked to a number of people regarding about Trump and what he represents. Trump represents sort of a branch of the elite that said we need to kind of rein it back a little bit. Globalism has gone too far. It's time to kind of perhaps reinvest in the United States.
We talked about this last time, I remember.
Yeah. So I think there's the same thing with the Brexit, and that's why some people call Trump's election American Brexit, because it's very inchoate. It's not really well defined what he represents, what he's doing. I saw an interesting headline the other day, just buying a cup of coffee at a 7-Eleven, and it goes, what newspaper was it? It was Bill Gates, and Bill Gates sees nationalism as a threat to global order.
Oh boy!
I bet he does.
And that's a good thing.
And I guess, like I said, I'm not. I don't necessarily think that government's initially good or nationalism is always good, but compared to globalism, it's a healthy thing because it's a form of sort of maintaining some semblance of local control in your life. It's the same reason.
So what's happening now is an organic. It's not just part of the dialectic. It's an organic reaction.
Well, I think there's an element that it's organic that will be obviously will try to be managed.
Yeah.
Obviously be managed. So there's dialectics and there's trialectics and quadrilectics. These things. But there is some spontaneity. There is some. I think some. They don't control everything. They control the broad, cultural agenda. The network news, the entertainment you see, even the music. But in the end of the day, we haven't been completely assimilated into the Borg yet. So, and they got to cope with it.
Yeah, that's a good thing to remember, that not everybody is. They're not all powerful, and they're not all knowing. And they may be clever, but they're not. There's some things that happen that are that are beyond their control, and I think we give them too much credit sometimes by just saying,
well, that might be part of the psychological warfare.
Yeah.
It's the point I talked to Jay last time, talking about he wrote that thing about Trump, which got him a lot of criticism also.
Yeah.
Sure. But I see his point. What he was saying was that, if you read 1984, you have Winston being told that if you want a vision of O'Brien telling Winston, if you want a vision of the future, imagine a boot stomping on a human face forever. Now that, that's rather demoralizing.
Yes. Yes.
Right? I mean, and I made the point, that's true. I mean, he said, if all was hopeless, I just said to Jays, if all was hopeless, I wouldn't be having this conversation with you. If they controlled everything, I wouldn't be reading the books I read, So, right. I mean, and despair is the ultimate sin, right? I mean, that's the one you can't.
There's something lazy about it too. I mean, it is a sin, but it's also just like, it sort of gives you permission somehow to I don't know, just to not try, to not resist, to not do what you need to do, because what's the point? They're going to win anyway.
I mean, if it were hopeless, I wouldn't have 6 children.
There you go.
I wouldn't be homeschooling them.
Good job.
These things.
I've just got 2, so you're way more hopeful than I am. Clearly, 3 times more hopeful.
Yeah. And like I said, having children is the most fulfilling and also the most frustrating, terrifying thing you ever do. But a lot of people, remember, for entire generations have been, not entire generation, but large portions of the generation. I've run into so many people who said, I don't want children. It's so bad out there,
Yeah. Why bring a child into this world?
I was like, what? I mean, well, there's one way you can make it better.
Yeah.
Raise a decent human being.
Yeah.
And, that's,
Which can be done.
Yeah, I'm not, storming the barricades. I'm not changing I'm not overturning the New World Order, but I am changing the world.
In your own way.
I'm changing the world in one small way.
Small but significant way.
Yeah. And that's what they don't want you to think.
Yeah, sure.
That's what all this, environmentalism about, this catastrophism and all this stuff is about you,
Yeah.
It isn't to say there aren't real problems out there, but a lot of the stuff is just meant to demoralize you. And that's when I think a lot of, you hear stories about, total surveillance and these things. They want that chilling effect,
Yeah, and I sometimes wonder if, there are people like, if you follow social media or you go on YouTube or whatever, just if you're part of the dissident culture in some way, it seems like there's always these kinds of nattering nabobs of negativism who are just who pipe it, who you hear from now and then, and you're tempted to wonder if they're not shills sent there to demoralize, or if the other possibilities, they could just be people who actually have given up hope and are just now being lazy because they're hopeless. And either way, it's something to be resisted.
Yeah, because that's the ultimate. It's the ultimate defeat is despair, and
sure.
That's what Judas did wrong, right?
Yeah.
When he hung himself.
Yes, that's right. He could have been even with the terrible thing he did. He still could have been forgiven.
Yeah, and so that's what people have to remember when we're talking. It can be a little overwhelming because there's so many lies and it's like,
Oh yeah.
And it can be overwhelming if you decide to, take it, try to swallow it all at once,
Yeah, sure.
To me, it's been for me personally, it's been a gradual thing. So I haven't quite had the same shattering of illusions that maybe some people experience,
Right. Well, we all approach it in our own way and with our own baggage, and we all have to do our part.
Yeah. So, but going back to this thing, so this article, you were just pointing out how. Oh, one point I wanted to bring out was the reason why it matters, because the bombing campaign itself against Germany of course, I mentioned how it actually inhibited the war effort and just caused needless destruction. Of course, that might have been part of the idea, was to sort of psychologically decapitate the German people, which was all part of the Morgenthau plan and being called for, both not only by the I think by Jewish power, but also by British power.
And even though they didn't follow the Morgenthau plan, they did end up dividing Germany.
Yes, they did. So it was implemented in somewhat. And you see, I guess I mentioned, Eisenhower's death camps and these things. It looked like they're part of what was indeed implemented. But the whole idea of the bombing campaign itself as being vital to the war effort would affect war planners in the Cold War. Because obviously we saw what happened in Vietnam, in Korea, where Korea was just bombed, North Korea was pretty much obliterated by American bombs, napalm, and also bombing. But this Jupiter complex, because, of course, in the Cold War, we had the development of Strategic Air Command and Curtis LeMay, who got control of the nuclear arsenal. And, Curtis LeMay, who wanted to, I think it was LeMay, you hear the development of MAD, which is, people say it worked, but it only worked because we were lucky. No missiles were launched. It works as long as the missiles aren't launched. Yeah. So, it's a tough way to find out that the doctrine is false, when you're suffering through a nuclear holocaust. Oh, I guess we were wrong. But Curtis LeMay, this guy who ran the Strategic Air Command, he was a product of the Allied air campaign, particularly against Japan.
And he was a nasty son of a bitch too, like Bomber Harris, wasn't he? He just wanted to kill them all, basically.
And you have Henry Hap Arnold, who wanted, after Nagasaki, mustered a 1,000-plane raid on Tokyo just to see that he could get 1,000 planes in the air at once. And this is after Nagasaki.
Yeah.
And this is, of course, Tokyo was slammed in March of 1945. So they burned. We think of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the firebomb, the conventional raids were as bad.
Sure.
Were as bad. Obviously, the moral threshold had been crossed. Just with the development of the atomic bomb, a technical threshold had been crossed. But Curtis LeMay, who I think he actually drew up a plan. He wanted to drop nuclear bombs in Vietnam, and drew up a plan in 1949 to destroy 77 Russian cities in a single day. Preemptive war. Because we got to bomb them and get those bastards now before they get us. This is the madness that this Jupiter complex creates.
Jupiter, that's like God, but like a pagan version of the God complex.
Yeah, God, yeah. And LeMay, he's the one that he talked to his, the civilians who were his superiors. I ask you, would things be much worse if Khrushchev were Secretary of Defense? Obviously, they don't want to start bombing; they're communist. But then his successor was Thomas Power over there at SAC, Strategic Air Command, and LeMay himself said Thomas Power was not stable and probably a sadist. That's LeMay talking.
Yeah.
And LeMay ran as Governor Wallace's vice presidential candidate in 1968. He was on a ticket.
Oh, wow. You know what? I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
That's really something.
But Thomas Power, he says, when Iran's study advancing limited nuclear warfare reached his desk, he says, this is from the Rand Corporation, and Thomas Power asked the guy who presented the report to him, why are you so concerned with saving their lives? The whole idea is to kill the bastards. At the end of the war, if there are 2 Americans and 1 Russian, we win. So they inherit this burning cinder called planet Earth. We win.
But they win. At least they won.
So there you go. This is the mindset that's created by this. And of course, with that, you also get McNamara, who was LeMay's war planner in Japan, over Japan, and he goes to work for Kennedy. Actually, first Ford Motor Corporation, and produces the Etzel, I think. But
and I point out in my article too how the people who committed this atrocity at Dresden, nothing happened to them. They were feted afterwards as heroes, but if the war had gone the other way, they would have been in the dock, just like we saw the various the various people at Nuremberg, 1945 and 46, they would have been. I mean, I remember seeing a picture like from I think it was a sci-fi alternate history thing, and it was the same kind of iconic picture of all the Nazi war criminals standing there, like with wearing the thing on their head, the headphones and stuff. But this time instead it was Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt, and it was pretty good. It's pretty interesting, and made the point that everyone was a war criminal, but the only ones who got punished were the ones who lost.
Admiral Nimitz made that observation, I think, too, about trying some of the Japanese war criminals and some of the. But the Nuremberg trials, of course, the Nuremberg trials, all rules of evidence were thrown out, and it was a show trial, and you had testimony gotten under torture. We know that now; it's admitted. But there's an interesting episode of Nuremberg trial when Hermann Goering, who was weaned off opium and was lucid during the trial, had sort of a comeback, rhetorically speaking. He was being cross-examined by Justice Jackson, who was the prosecutor there, the Supreme Court Justice Jackson. And Goering admitted to the charges that he had planned to assist in ending the Weimar Republic and revise the unjust conditions of the Versailles Treaty. He bluntly admitted that he planned to do this by rebuilding the German Air Force and using military force to correct these wrongs in his mind, and revise the Versailles Treaty. If not, they couldn't do it through diplomacy. They were perfectly willing to do it through force. Then Goering stated that he had planned to use military force to achieve these political objectives as a statesman, and had done as other statesmen had done throughout history. And some of the British justices admitted that, they really couldn't argue with that. It was no different than any other politician or general. It's one of these things where, again, was Britain really? Were the Russians really allowed to sit in judgment of the Germans at Nuremberg, the Russian Germans, with the things they did? And
exactly.
The same things go for the British, the Americans, and the French, because they all had their empires and spheres of influence. They had gone through similar means. It just wasn't. They just weren't they're losers.
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely.
So, Andy, any other observations? Anything that I'm missing in this article that you want to get out, or that you want to address? Or?
No, I think we've pretty well covered it. I would just say that, I felt particularly compelled. I feel particularly compelled to talk about things like Dresden, just because they are, number one, so worth talking about in any sense, no matter what. Because it's such a significant event and such an obvious war crime, but also because I think that it's worth drawing attention to things that need to be paid attention to, but that are maybe inconvenient to to our would-be rulers and what they would like us to pay attention to, and the kind of way of viewing things that they would like us to have. And so that's what I see it as my role to talk about things like Dresden, and again, I think I try to make this clear in the article, not because I want to go the other way and lionize the Axis powers and demonize the Allies, but just because it's in so many ways so emblematic of what's happened, what's gone on in one way or another, and it's in various dimensions of what they call man's inhumanity to man. Who do you know who said that in the first place? Who first talked about it? It's a very pompous sounding phrase, but I hear it talked about a lot, but I don't know who said it.
Yeah, I know who said it. It's like the banality of evil.
Yeah.
maybe
it's
Aaron,
one of those things. I mean, it's I guess been overused, but it's one of those. It's what I see Dresden as being emblematic of in so many ways, and so I hope your listeners, if you haven't read it yet, will maybe go over and check it out.
Mm-hmm. Now, you don't have the article at your fingertips there?
I don't have it at my fingertips.
Okay. Well, just to give it justice, I'm going to read a couple paragraph from it.
Yeah, sure.
Because you make this point, and I think you make it well here. If one removes one's partisan blinders, however, one cannot escape noticing that World War II was little more than a massive campaign of unremitting carnage and horror, regardless of whose side you took in the affair. Paleocons, isolationists, Buchananites, anti-welfare, warfare state libertarians, and other contemporary intellectual dissidents have often pointed out that, contrary to the rah-rah triumphalism trumpeted by both the mainstream right and left, the outcome of the war was, in fact, deeply deleterious to much of the world, particularly Eastern Europe, which was immediately subsumed by Stalin and reduced to Soviet helotry, following Churchill and Roosevelt's skullduggery, betrayal, and capitulation at the Yalta Conference. But it must be added as a counterweight to such observations that a National Socialist victory would have also had similarly dire results for much of the population of Europe. In the post-war world, a man like Alexander Solzhenitsyn emerged as a gusty and courageous witness against the pathological tyranny of Bolshevism, but no less righteous were such stalwarts against Hitlerian totalitarianism as Klaus von Stauffenberg and Hans and Sophie Scholl. If we overemphasize one gross, ghastly form of oppression at the expense of the other, we do the victims of each bloody regime a disservice. So,
well
lest
said.
anyone think we're not praising Hitler here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and I actually get in trouble with some of my readers because there are some sympathizers with National Socialism, and I wrote an article about Hans and Sophie Scholl actually on the anniversary of them being put to death in Germany, and got a lot of flack for it, but I stand where I do, and I try to stand on the side of righteousness and not take a partisan stand. Yeah.
And again, a lot of these people are caught in the middle of something. If you're a German and you're thrown into this maelstrom, what do you do?
Yeah.
And so it's again, if you look, like I said, the war. I don't think you can separate World War II from World War One. And also, I particularly, through my research, I look at the meta level, and when I examine the meta level of the war, I point a finger at Great Britain, and it's geostrategizing against Germany and then Russia.
Yeah.
And it's perfidious Albion that's the center of this. And yet problem with war is you just can't go to 1939 or 1938 and look at Munich. Or the Rhineland, or yet you go back further and further in history. Both the Bolsheviks and the Nazis crawled out of the trenches of World War One, and so it was a reaction to something. And you're right. It's just as you said in that article. It's the whole thing was just darn lamentable. Let's just say that.
Tragedy.
So. But we don't. Again, the real tragedy is the people's tendency to feel triumphant. Do you have a picture in there? You have these soldiers, the victors or something in the article. You have these.
I think Colin also wrote Colin Liddell.
That's right. I read that article too. Yeah.
About Dresden. And I think that might be what you're thinking of.
So and look, he writes it from a British perspective. I think he's a British expat living in Japan.
Yes.
And how the British Empire itself was just, was this husk of an empire, of a state after the war. And how the war exhausted the British Empire after that. And,
pretty much.
At least as an overt power. I think the city of London still carries a lot of weight in the world these days.
Yes, that's true.
They sort of transplanted over to, the empire shifted to the United States after that.
Mm-hmm.
So... But that's how these Venetians operate, I think. It's the black nobility. That's the theory. They go from country to country and take it over for a century or so, then move on.
That's like the history behind the history.
Yes.
What we don't see.
The Venetians, the black nobility, that's doing it. So, well, Andy, listen, anything else? I mean, I've had you for an hour and a half. Is there anything else you want to?
Yeah, no. I think I think
Did we cover it well?
We've been pretty exhaustive and covered the whole ghastly spectacle.
Yeah, it's not a long article. It's Dresden was not the bomb. I highly recommend it. Also recommend the article that's linked by Colin Liddell regarding Dresden. It's an article. It packed a lot of, not many words, but there's a lot of insight in it. So I thought it warranted a longer discussion. And so,
yeah.
So I invited you on. Thanks for coming.
Well, thanks for having me.
Great. That's Andy Nowicki. He's the author of Conspiracy, Compliance, Control, and Defiance, a primer on what is to be done. And he's the assistant. You're still the assistant editor of Alternative Right?
That's correct.
Okay. And of course, you do the Namelesss Podcast, right?
I do the Namelesss Podcast. I also join the Boiler Room crew on Thursday nights, and I've written the book you mentioned as well as several others.
Great. Well, listen, Andy, thanks a lot for coming on, and I will we'll talk again in the near future, I hope. And
yes.
When I post this, I'll send you the link. I might stagger this one a little bit, so it might be a week or so, but I'll send you the link when I do it. It's because it's not topical, so timely,
yes, that's true.
I can do it.
Although I guess we're getting out of the. Well, I guess we're post Dresden now.
Yeah, post Dresden anyway. But not many
so it's
people
not
think
topical
about,
in that sense either. So yeah,
Valentine's Day overshadows Dresden all the time. So.
Well, I've sometimes wondered if why is never Dresden Valentine? Why is that never been a title for something?
Yeah,
they intersect. All right. Well, thanks again. It's been fun.
Great, thanks for coming on, and take care, and enjoy what remains of the winter, and spring will be here soon.
All right, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Long, long time ago, I can still remember how that music used to make me smile. And I knew if I had my chance that I could make those people dance. Maybe they'd be happy for a while. But February made me shiver with every paper I deliver. Bad news on the doorstep. I couldn't take one more step. I can't remember if I cried when I read about his widowed bride. But something touched me deep inside the day the music died. So bye-bye, Miss American Pie. Rode my Chevy to the levee, but the levee was dry. Them good old boys were drinking whiskey and rye, singing, this will be the day that I die. This will be the day that I die. Did you write the book of love, and do you have faith in God above? If the Bible tells you so, now do you believe in rock and roll? Can music save your mortal soul? And can you teach me how to dance real slow? Well, I know that you're in love with him, 'cause I saw you dancing in the gym. You both kicked off your shoes. Man, I dig those rhythm and blues. I was a lonely teenage rockin' buck with a pink carnation and a pickup.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.TV.